Friends, thank you for being here today. Did you realize that Mexico, a nation frequently perceived as reliant on the United States, is currently holding one of the most significant advantages in the global economy? In reality, the U.S. is more dependent on Mexico than the average American understands. Mexico isn't just the world's top exporter of avocados or automobiles, it has evolved into a critical hub within U.S. supply chains. Key industries, from electronics to pharmaceuticals, now depend on Mexico to maintain their production operations. But here is the critical point. While the U.S. relies heavily on Mexico, Mexico has been methodically building its own leverage. This situation isn't about politics, immigration, or border issues. It revolves around something much more fundamental: economics. What would happen if Mexico chose to exercise its newfound power? What if the relationship between the two countries, which has always been delicate, were to suddenly fracture? The consequences for the U.S. could materialize faster than anyone anticipates. You are about to discover how Mexico, long considered merely a trade partner, is transforming into a major force capable of reshaping everything from international trade routes to energy policies, and why the United States might be unprepared for this shift. For many decades, the U.S. has maintained a narrow perspective on its relationship with Mexico, concentrating on issues like migration, border security, and political rhetoric. However, the underlying reality is that the economic connections between these two nations are vastly more intricate and essential than most Americans grasp. At the core of this relationship is an inescapable truth: Mexico now serves as a foundation for American production. The U.S. is Mexico's primary trading partner, and in return, Mexico has become a leading exporter to the U.S. This goes beyond the consumer products you see, such as avocados and cars, which are merely the visible aspects. Behind the scenes, Mexico has discreetly become the manufacturing workshop for a significant segment of U.S. industry. Sectors like electronics, automotive parts, and pharmaceuticals, previously based largely in the U.S., are now being assembled south of the border. This shift is mainly driven by cost effective labor and efficient trade agreements. This dependency is crucial because of production costs. Wages in Mexico are considerably lower than in the U.S., making it an ideal location for corporations aiming to reduce expenses. However, other factors are also at play. Mexico's infrastructure, its close proximity to the U.S., and streamlined trade pacts like the former NAFTA, now USMCA, make it an exceptionally appealing location for American companies to move their production facilities. But this strategy, designed to enhance corporate profits, has inadvertently created a precarious situation. As U.S. companies shifted their operations to Mexico to leverage cheaper labor, they grew increasingly dependent on the country's manufacturing capacity. Consequently, Mexico has gained significant leverage. When the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was enacted in 1994, it was celebrated as a landmark achievement in U.S. Mexico relations. The agreement promised a new era of open trade intended to stimulate economic growth for all parties. In reality, the outcome was far more complicated. While NAFTA did increase trade, it also hastened the migration of factories from the US to Mexico as American companies pursued lower labor and production costs. Over time, this trend produced major consequences. Factories that once operated in cities like Detroit or states like Ohio and Wisconsin were now found in Monterrey, Guadalajara, or Tijuana. Jobs that had been the bedrock of the American industrial sector started to vanish. Fast forward to 2018, when the Trump administration renegotiated NAFTA, resulting in the United States Mexico Canada Agreement, USMCA. Although this new deal was presented as an improvement, particularly for American workers, its fundamental structure remained largely unchanged. U.S. corporations retained access to less expensive labor in Mexico, and Mexico continued to capitalize on its proximity to the American market. The significant change is not in the trade framework itself, but in Mexico's increasing recognition of its own power. No longer just a low cost manufacturing center, Mexico has diversified into an energy producer, a developing consumer market, and an important actor on the geopolitical stage. The old arrangement no longer benefits Mexico as it once did. The country is now prioritizing labor rights, domestic energy production, and equitable economic growth. What will occur when Mexico begins to use its leverage to demand better terms? As wages gradually increase, the cheap labor model could unravel, creating a domino effect throughout U.S. supply chains. For years, Mexico was viewed as a subordinate partner manufacturing inexpensive goods for U.S. corporations. That perception is rapidly becoming obsolete, compelling both nations to reconsider their economic relationship. When American politicians discuss the migration crisis at the southern border, their focus is often on border security, heightened enforcement, and physical barriers. However, the unspoken truth is that migration is not the root of the problem, but a symptom of a much deeper issue that has developed over decades. The actual cause is the economic disparity created by U.S. policies. For years, the U.S. has inundated Mexico with subsidized agricultural products. While this may seem like a standard trade practice, it has been ruinous for small scale Mexican farmers. These farmers, who once supplied food for their local communities and the nation, have been driven out of business by cheap American imports. The consequence is a nation with a large population of displaced workers who have limited options other than to seek opportunities elsewhere, often by heading north to the U.S. simultaneously. U.S. corporations have relocated jobs to Mexico under the banner of free trade. While this has resulted in cheaper goods for American consumers, it has also led to the exploitation of low wage workers in Mexico. These workers often endure poor conditions with few, if any, labor protections because they desperately need employment to survive. What U.S. politicians seldom address is that this economic model has created a deprived underclass on both sides of the border, with limited opportunities and few pathways out of poverty. For decades, Mexico has been a significant participant in the global energy market, primarily as an oil supplier to the United States. This dynamic, however, is changing quickly. Mexico possesses substantial oil and gas reserves, but more critically, it is moving to assert greater control over its own energy resources. This represents a major shift in its relationship with the US and the international community. Historically, American corporations have had a strong presence in Mexico's energy sector. For years, U.S. companies benefited from access to Mexico's natural resources, extracting oil and gas with minimal government oversight. Recently, however, the Mexican government has started to reevaluate this arrangement. There is now a growing movement toward nationalizing or at least implementing stricter controls over these energy resources. This policy change is not merely about achieving energy independence, it is about asserting economic sovereignty. This new approach is unsettling for U.S. corporations and investors who have long depended on open access to Mexico's energy industry. If Mexico tightens its control over oil and gas production, it will no longer function simply as a source of cheap energy for American industries. Instead, Mexico will emerge as a more strategic force in global energy markets. This development has the potential to significantly disrupt U.S. energy imports and compel the U.S. to adjust to new energy realities. But the shift extends beyond oil and gas. Mexico is also advancing in the renewable energy sector. The country has vast potential for solar and wind power, and investment in these areas is increasing. Mexico's push toward renewables is not just an environmental initiative, it is a strategic move to diversify its energy portfolio and enhance its leverage in global energy negotiations. This transformation is already causing effects in global markets. If Mexico chooses to prioritize its domestic energy needs over foreign demands, the U.S. could experience a supply shortage, particularly if it continues to depend on Mexico for a large portion of its energy imports. The United States has long been accustomed to having a stable and reliable energy partner to its south. That assumption may no longer be valid. As Mexico solidifies its energy sovereignty, it will become a much more influential player on the world stage. This raises a critical question for U.S. policymakers. What happens if Mexico decides to use its energy resources as a strategic tool in future negotiations? The era of viewing Mexico as a junior energy partner may be drawing to a close, and the U.S. could be facing a significant reality check as the trade conflict between the U.S. and China continues to escalate. Mexico finds itself in a distinctive position that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in North America. While the United States has traditionally seen Mexico as a source of cheap labor and low cost manufacturing, a significant transformation is occurring within the country. In recent years, social movements in Mexico have been building momentum, concentrating on labor rights, environmental protection, and more balanced development. These movements are about more than just social justice. They are actively reshaping Mexico's economic relationship with the U.S. and the world. One of the most impactful of these is the growing demand for improved labor standards. For decades, Mexico has served as a center for low wage labor, where many workers have endured poor working conditions and had limited rights. However, Mexican workers are now increasingly organizing to demand higher wages, better benefits, and safer workplaces. This change in labor dynamics is starting to undermine the very foundation of the cheap labor model that U.S. corporations have long relied upon. This shift in labor activism is already creating ripple effects in the U.S. Mexico economic relationship. If Mexican workers are successful in their push for higher wages, it could drastically change the cost structure for American companies that have outsourced production to Mexico. The concept of cheap labor, once the primary driver for moving factories south, could collapse under the pressure of these social demands. This would, in turn, compel U.S. corporations to reassess their supply chains and production strategies, which could lead to higher prices for consumers in the United States. But labor is not the only area where change is happening. Environmental movements in Mexico are also gaining strength, with activists challenging destructive mining operations, the exploitation of natural resources, and unsustainable farming practices. Mexico's natural wealth, from oil and minerals to forests, has long been a target for global corporations seeking to extract resources with little concern for the environmental consequences. Now, Mexican environmentalists are calling for stronger environmental protections, promoting sustainable development, and holding multinational corporations accountable for their ecological impact. For years, the U.S. has viewed Mexico as a subordinate economic partner, a place for inexpensive labor, low cost goods, and convenient trade deals. But this perception is rapidly becoming obsolete. Mexico, once seen as a dependent nation, has transformed into an economic powerhouse that has quietly built up leverage in trade, energy, and global affairs. A reckoning is on the horizon, and the U.S. is largely unprepared for this shift. Mexico's economic significance to the U.S. is immense. Over the last 2 decades, Mexico has become essential to U.S. supply chains, with industries from electronics and automotive to pharmaceuticals depending heavily on Mexican production. However, the very factors that made Mexico an appealing destination for U.S. corporations, lower wages, relaxed labor laws, and strategic proximity are now the same factors empowering Mexico to demand more favorable terms. It is no longer just about cheap labor. Mexico is establishing itself as a major player in energy production, international trade, and geopolitical strategy. This strategic repositioning is most evident in Mexico's intricate dance with China. As the trade war between Washington and Beijing intensifies, American companies are desperately seeking alternatives to Chinese manufacturing to avoid tariffs and geopolitical instability. Mexico has emerged as the premier destination for this nearshoring trend. Its geographical proximity, established manufacturing base, and preferential access to the U.S. market under the USMCA make it an obvious choice. On the surface, this appears to be a win-win for the U.S. and Mexico, reducing American reliance on a geopolitical rival while boosting Mexico's industrial sector. However, The reality is far more complex. Mexico has not turned its back on Beijing. In fact, China has become a major investor in Mexico, pouring capital into infrastructure projects and manufacturing facilities. Chinese companies are setting up their own operations in northern Mexico, creating a situation where products are assembled in Mexico using Chinese components and then exported to the US. This creates a sophisticated triangulation of trade. Mexico benefits from both American and Chinese investment, while Chinese goods find a backdoor into the US. Market bypassing direct tariffs. For the United States, this presents a double-edged sword. While production moves out of China, Chinese economic influence is not diminished, it is simply relocated closer to home. This dynamic grants Mexico unprecedented leverage. It is no longer a junior partner subject to the whims of Washington, but a pivotal player positioned between the world's two largest economies. It can negotiate for more favorable terms on trade, investment, and energy from both sides, playing one superpower off the other. If the US pushes too hard on labor standards or environmental regulations, Mexico can pivot toward deeper ties with China. If Chinese investment comes with undesirable conditions, the allure of the American market provides a powerful counterbalance. This strategic autonomy is the true foundation of Mexico's rising power. The impending reckoning for the US, therefore, is not simply about rising costs. It's about a fundamental loss of control over its own economic destiny. The supply chains that once seemed secure and cost effective are now subject to the strategic calculations of a newly empowered Mexico. Disruptions could arise not just from logistical hiccups, but from deliberate policy decisions made in Mexico City. As Mexican labor movements continue to succeed in securing higher wages and better conditions, the cheap labor advantage will fully erode. American corporations will find themselves trapped, unable to afford the new cost structure in Mexico, yet unable to return to a hostile and expensive manufacturing environment in China. Ultimately, the balance of power in North America is being redrawn. The era of unquestioned US dominance is over. Washington must now contend with a neighbor that is not only economically indispensable, but also diplomatically astute and increasingly independent. Ignoring this new reality is a luxury the United States can no longer afford. The future of the US Mexico relationship will not be one of dependency, but one of interdependence and negotiation. If the US fails to adapt, to treat Mexico as a genuine equal and engage with its legitimate interests, it will find itself increasingly isolated and vulnerable in a world where its southern neighbor holds more of the cards than it ever imagined.